40% of Americans wouldn't be able to come up with $400 if they needed to in an emergency financial situation, $400. And that was before the pandemic. That was before the jobless claims numbers that we've seen. If you've been tracking the news, another 4.4 million people filed for unemployment benefits, jobless claims this week, bringing the 5-week total to over 26 million people who are out of work. And that is not to count the millions of people who have had their hours reduced or maybe face a very uncertain future. And that means 26 million people without work. That means that a lot of people are trying to figure out how they can pay rent. They're trying to figure out how they can put food on the table. They're trying to figure out how they can keep the lights on, how they can keep insurance of some kind, on and on and on. These needs come. And it's been widely publicized. You've seen it. The stimulus has been approved and checks have gone out this past week. They're still going out. But we're hearing the reports that many people have not received those checks for one reason or another. We've also heard that unemployment benefits, there's been a move to increase the benefit from states, but those too, there's been delays in that. That means that there's a lot of people with no income or severely reduced income coming on and on and on. We know these things. We've been watching the news. And if you're a pastor or a leader in your church or just someone in a congregation that cares about people around you and in your church, you know there's a lot of people hurting, and there's people in your community who may not yet be connected to your church who are hurting. Now, as to today's topics, many churches, potentially your church, has set up a fund, a benevolence fund, for people in need. Whether that's built into your regular budget as a part of kind of you've set aside money at the start of the year when you begin your budget cycle, or you do regular collections for benevolence. That's oftentimes a stopgap for people in great need. But our conversation today is, given our current moment, how do we as pastors and church leaders think about how do we do this well when maybe the needs are more than we've ever seen for benevolence? But also maybe the funds that we have available are lessened. And how do we navigate just in making decisions, the practical decisions that we'll face? Well, I'm so glad that you've joined us for today's conversation, because we have 3 fantastic panelists who will be helping us think well about how to do benevolence ministry during this pandemic. Our first panelist is Brian Fickert. Many of you will know him for his work with When Helping Hurts. He's the founder and president at the Chalmers Center at Covenant College, where he's also a professor of economics and community development. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Give us just a little bit of sense of your context and your work.
Yeah, so I'm a professor. I'm also the founder and president of this thing called the Chalmers Center. We are a church equipping organization. We seek to equip churches both in the United States and around the world to walk amongst people who are poor in ways that restore the poor to all that God has created them to be. I'm actually in my office at home right now. I'm sheltering in place like everybody else. And in fact, I've spent a lot of hours in this little office in the past 6 weeks or so. But it's great to be with you folks.
Thanks, Brian. Fantastic to have you with us today. We also have Steve Corbett, the co-author of When Helping Hurts. He's Associate Professor of Community Development at Covenant College and Community Development Specialist at the Chalmers Center. Steve, great to have you with us, and tell us a little bit about your context, your work.
Hey, just real quick. So my wife and I first got involved in this work in 1984. So I spent about 20 years working primarily international, but for the last almost 20 years, I've been working with Brian. He helped bring me to the Chalmers Center. We've been working in the community development major. So very much same portfolio as Brian. I teach full-time at Covenant, so I spend more time in the classroom and part-time at Chalmers. That's probably the only difference, but very much we've been doing a lot of the same things and thinking together a lot for the last 20 years.
Thank you, Steve.
And I'm also an elder in my church, and so thinking about how do we do benevolence well in our small rural community in Northwest Georgia.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us, Steve. And many of us have been helped by When Helping Hurts that Brian and Steve wrote. They have also written a book, if you're not aware of it, specifically on church benevolence, helping without hurting in church benevolence. And that's certainly a resource that we're going to be pointing to later on in today's conversation. But thank you for joining us. Finally, our final panelist is Pastor Eric Youngblood. And Eric is senior pastor at Rock Creek Fellowship in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And he's going to be sharing some pastoral perspective on how churches are putting benevolence into practice in his current situation right now. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your context and where you pastor.
It's great to be with you guys. Thanks for having us. Yes, I've been at this church, Rock Creek Fellowship. We have 2 locations on the back of Lookout Mountain. We're near Covenant College. And so we're in a quasi-rural situation where we have most of our people work in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we have a lot of white-collar folks, but we live among a lot of mixed white and blue-collar folk. And so we're less densely populated where our church is actually located.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Eric. Fantastic to have a pastoral perspective in this conversation today. So here's how it's going to work. For the very first half of our webinar time, we'll be hearing from our panel. Each of them will be presenting some different ideas. And then the second half is really designed to answer your questions, your comments, the things that you're putting into practice, your realities in your church. So to do that, to interact with the panel and engage in questions, you've got a Q&A tab on the bottom of your Zoom window, and that's on the bottom section of your window. So look for that Q&A, and your question will come directly to the panelists. And we do want to hear from you. We want to hear your comments, your questions, whatever those are. And you can send those at any time during the presentations, and we'll get to those a little bit later. I wanted to start, though, our conversation today with a poll just to find out who you are and what your context is. We have about 1,000 people joining us for this call, so we'll get a good sample set here. But a poll is going to be coming up on your screen. You should see that, and there are 3 questions that we want you to answer. First of all, do you have a benevolence fund set up in your church? Simple yes or no. Number 2, how have requests for benevolence help changed in the past few weeks? Have you seen an uptick yet? Have they increased? Have they stayed about the same or decreased? And then finally, how do you process and meet needs through your benevolence ministry? Do you have kind of a team, or is it centralized funds through the church? Is it kind of organically by encouraging generosity of your members? So it's not as much a program as just saying help one another, maybe through your small group structure or another way. Or do you primarily partner with other organizations that provide resources? Okay, results are coming in, and a lot of you are voting. Where we've got almost 400 people weighing into the poll, and 94% of you said, yes, you do have a benevolence fund. So today's conversation is probably not as much about setting up a benevolence fund. It's the 94% of you who are already have one in place. But there are some of you, 7%, that don't yet have a benevolence fund set up. Second question is, how have requests for benevolence funds changed in the past few weeks? 46% of you said that they've increased. Another 46% said it stayed the same. So that represents 92% of you are either increased or staying the same as usual needs. And then finally, how do you process and meet needs through your benevolence ministry? 65% of you said that there's centralized funds through a church. Another 20% says that you're actively encouraging generosity through the members of your church, just to be aware of needs around them. And another 14 or 15% are looking outside of the church to organizations. So 65, 20, and 15. Thank you so much for participating in the poll. And that gives us a little sense of who you are and your context. The final thing that I'll say, I've said this the last couple of weeks, is Zoom bombing is a real thing. If you don't know what that is, you can Google it. But Zoom bombing is just people coming in from the outside. They're not actually joining our webinar. We've taken steps to eliminate that. But if for some reason that comes across your screen, we'll just all ignore it as participants and act like it didn't happen and keep learning. So I just wanted to make that note. We want to go now to our first panelist, and we're going to start with Brian. And Brian, you've done a lot of thinking about this. You published a book on church benevolence, but help us think through what are the key paradigms that we need to be thinking of or might be different in our time of COVID-19. So help us think about that.
That's great, Matt. Thanks so much. Well, as you know, Matt was mentioning, We were privileged about a little over a decade ago to write this book, When Helping Hurts, that God has used a number of ways, and there's a study guide associated with it, and then a series of books following on that, Helping Without Hurting in Short-Term Missions, and also Helping Without Hurting in Church Benevolence. And we actually have an online course we're about to launch in Church Benevolence that some of you might be interested in. But I want to kind of think, from the framework that are in these books and these resources, how should we think about doing benevolence in this particular crisis? And just very briefly, what we do in these books is try to root our understanding of poverty alleviation in God's overall story of creation, fall, redemption. And what we argue in the creation account is that human beings are deeply wired for relationship. And so we're not just autonomous individuals. The boundary of the human being, if you will, it's actually the relationships in this diagram that we are wired for relationship with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the rest of creation. So we're not just bodies, and we're not even just bodies and souls. We're body, soul, relational creatures. And that has huge implications for everything we do, including our benevolence work. We need, when that woman walks into our church asking for help with her electric bill, she's not just a body. She's not just a body and soul. She's a body, soul, relational creature. Just, a couple implications from this very quickly. The relationship with the rest of creation includes the idea of work, of unpacking and unfolding God's good creation. So the crisis that's upon us is not just a loss of material resources, but when people lose their jobs, they're losing a deep sense of who they are in the world. And that broken relationship with creation is going to ripple through all that's happening with them. And so it's going to probably lead to issues of depression, anxiety, conflict. We are wired for work. And secondly, notice the relationship with others. The social isolation is a disaster for human flourishing. The previous Surgeon General has actually argued that to be lonely in America is the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per day in terms of its effects on our health and our lifespans. And that was way before the crisis ever hit. And so part of what we had to be thinking about as we're thinking about the needy in our congregations and our communities is material, yes, but also deeply relational, which affects the material. Now, the way that God designs his world is that we're supposed to unpack and unfold his world. We're supposed to create culture. And so in a world without sin, we would create economic, political, religious, and social systems. These are part of the goodness of the created order. There's a sense in which there's two stages to creation. There's the creation of the natural world in Genesis chapter 1, but then there's the continuing, ongoing unfolding of God's good creation, in which human beings are supposed to unpack and unfold what God has deposited to his world. And the Bible teaches that Christ is actually part of that. Colossians chapter 1 says that Jesus Christ is the creator and sustainer of all things. Now, why does this matter? Well, folks, we're in an overwhelming situation. And what oftentimes happens for Christians is we kind of think the church is good and the culture around us isn't quite so good. And the reality of it is, it's all part of the created order. And so we don't have to say to ourselves, oh, the government is evil, or that nonprofit organization is evil. All good things come from the original created order that human beings are unfolding and unpacking. So our predisposition to culture ought not to be that's all horrible. Our predisposition ought to be it's part of the goodness of the creation, and we can look out there for other institutions and other organizations to help us, because quite frankly, the church can't solve this crisis on its own. Well, then in our work, we go on to talk about the fall, of course. The fall really did happen, and so it's not all good. It's all distorted, it's all broken. Individuals are broken, and so the systems that we create are broken. We don't want to deny that. So we can talk about a poverty of spiritual intimacy, a poverty of being, a poverty of community, a poverty of stewardship, that the fall has affected individuals and systems in ways that undermine human flourishing. None of us are experiencing these relationships in the way that God intended. But again, you have to hold these things in tension. You've got the goodness of creation and the effects of the fall. nothing right now is apart from the fall, but it's also the case that the goodness is still there. And so our predisposition towards the church and towards culture ought to be created, distorted, but redeemable. Now, one of the key messages in When Helping Hurts is that the way that different people are broken tends to mess up our work amongst the poor. And so in particular, we have on the bottom of this slide, those of us who are not generally materially poor. On the top, we have the kinds of ways that brokenness often expresses itself in poverty communities in America. I don't have time to unpack this right now, but I want to focus in on that relationship to self right now, because part of what we're trying to communicate in When Helping Hurts and the subsequent resources is that the way that many of us tend to be broken and the way that many chronically materially poor people tend to be broken is a bad mix. Because often we have a sense of pride, a sense of superiority, a sense that we are the solution for the poor. And the poor are often experiencing a marred identity, a sense of shame, a sense of inferiority, a sense of incapacity. And so that's a bad mix, because the ways that we speak to the materially poor, the ways we act towards them, often communicate what they're already feeling. You're less than human. You can't affect change in your life. You need us to fix you. And we often complement that message with lots of outside resources, which we say, you really can't do anything. You need us to help you using our financial resources, using our money. We argue When Helping Hurts that can actually exacerbate shame amongst the materially poor. It can exacerbate pride amongst us, and then it can actually create dependencies by locking them into the false stories they've been told. Now, one of the key things we want you to hear today is this is not that moment. This is not that moment. Yes, you have people who are in chronic poverty, who are probably suffering right now in particular ways. You need to think about this dynamic with respect to those people. But there's a whole bunch of other people who've been working for 30 years, and the way that they are broken isn't manifesting itself in an inability to work. And they just lost their jobs. And so those people are not in this dynamic. And so many of the principles we've laid out in When Helping Hurts aren't actually the ones you should focus on in this moment. What we want you to hear is that you ought to give a lot right now, that you ought to be overflowing with generosity and not having all kinds of angst, all kinds of concern. The vast majority of people that need help right now are not in this chronic situation. They are people who are newly unemployed, who really do need emergency help. And so, to summarize my part, what I want you to hear so far is most of what we've written doesn't apply to this situation. Okay, give. That's one thing. Secondly, you probably don't have enough resources to solve the problem. You've got to look to other resources beyond your local church. And I want to draw our attention right now to this verse, because I mentioned earlier that Jesus Christ is the creator and sustainer of all things, but he's also the reconciler of all things. You see, Jesus Christ is actively holding it all together, and he's redeeming it all. He's redeeming broken individuals and broken systems. And so we ought to have, again, this sense of optimism and hope that all the resources available to us in our communities are things that we can bring to bear to help the poor throughout this crisis situation. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Now I know why I had 7 kids, Brian, so that way we'll never be lonely, so my lungs will be clear. I have a few other health problems associated with that, but at least my lungs are good. All right, so I'm assuming out of the, I guess, 900 plus of you out there, a lot of you have either read When Helping Hurts or heard the basic ideas of it. So one of the things that we looked at is asking the question, why are people in this situation? What's caused it? So once you look at causality, then you can begin to think a little bit about what's the appropriate kind of intervention. And so that's where this historic kind of relief and rehabilitation development framework comes from. I first learned this way back in the 80s. It was there before that, but and first of all, these are very permeable things. These aren't like hard and fast you only do this like this, and then you move to this like this, and there's exact moments in time. But there are some perspectives here that are important. So the relief issue is basically some kind of crisis has happened, something has happened to somebody, whether it's on an individual basis or a large group basis that really wasn't primarily their fault. And so obviously COVID-19 is one of those examples where a lot of people, where something's come upon us, right? And so in relief, there's a couple of things that are important. One is that this is the time when that provider-receiver dynamic, you're in need, I have, we have, we're going to get it to you. And that is the main dynamic. Now, historically, over time, there's been different groups try to get a sense of, globally, when you look at poverty, how much of this is, relief, the right kind of response versus more the rehab development. And they come up with this loose, I'd hold these numbers really loosely, about 10% of all poverty in the world are crisis-based, that's the primary reason, and therefore need relief. So it's always been needed, but for us that have been in this work a long time, it's never the main thing. And so when we wrote the book, as Brian's saying, we were addressing what most people are experiencing, and there's the response to that. But right now we're obviously in a season where the crisis is bigger and it is affecting more people. So it's in front of, it's in front of our face a whole lot more. Relief tends to be immediate. And so there's a place for speed is important. I live in the Chattanooga area, and not only do I have the COVID, but we had tornadoes come through on Easter Sunday that were pretty rugged, and some deaths and lots of destruction. And so, you don't wait until, even if you didn't have COVID-19, you wouldn't wait till the summertime to bring a short-term team in. You need to get out there now and start helping people immediately. So there's a sense of time is important in relief when it is not crucial dynamic. As a matter of fact, sometimes our desire to press on and get things done gets in the way of good development work. So so rehab is kind of the idea of getting people back on their feet. So we will be looking at that maybe down the road as the pandemic ends, and we look at people's, what's the consequences of people being out of work for 2 months, and what does that look like, and what does it mean to get back on? Maybe they had they did all the Dave Ramsey stuff and they were really healthy, but now, wow, how do I get back to that? And so that's going to be a different period. We're not really there yet to think about that. Development, yes, Brian really well put out. That's really not what we're dealing with right now. And an easy way to talk about development, it is moving forward. It's taking people further. So it's kind of the green in that diagram. Relief is kind of the yellow in that diagram. The red is kind of the somebody's walking along and something happens and boom, down they go. And so relief is just kind of minimizing the pain and reducing the pain of whatever's caused that. But development is really a way, the core of that is people getting growing and their ability to look at their own lives, look at their own communities, look at their own context, make decisions for improvement, doing something that will improve the situation, and then being able to act on that. And there is so much packed around all of that. So I'm not going to spend time with that because this workshop, this webinar really is, hey, we're in a relief moment, as Brian's already laid out. So maybe a couple things to think about when we think about doing relief, especially, both Brian and I and Eric think a lot about the local church, not as the only thing. None of us believe that if the church was doing all it was supposed to do, then we wouldn't need the government to help. None of us believe that. So Brian tried to lay that out a little bit too as well. There's institutions out there that are created for good purposes and we should be, asking the questions, how do we help them succeed? And how do we partner with them? And how we help utilize them? But so in relief, typically, this kind of goes to the book we did on benevolence. Somebody shows up and they kind of have their presenting problem, and you listen to that. And historically, we kind of say, okay, is this what they're presenting? Is this really some kind of crisis has occurred to them that they didn't really cause a whole lot, and so more and more of that is happening. And so you still ask some questions about that. Probably the one of the things that Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify is still in place. You listen to those stories, you hear the situations. Now, if there are people you already know, this gets down to, who do you focus on? If there's people in your church that you want to make, and we are called to make sure we take care of people we're connected with, and especially the brethren. It may be easier to kind of know the backstory of the family and stuff, and be able to have a sense of, okay, we can kind of take this more at face value a bit. But for others, especially if you know larger churches, I'm in a small church of 150. We all know each other pretty well, and know our backgrounds pretty well. So that's a fairly easy thing for our deacons to kind of look at. But if it's somebody we don't know, then we got to do some things. Okay, they say they can't pay their rent. Maybe could you give us the name of your landlord? And we're going to get hold of the landlord and double check a little bit. Are they really not paying the rent? Oh, I lost my job. Well, who were you employed by? Well, maybe you could give us the employer. We could check. Did you actually even work there? Is this true? So there might be a little bit more you have to go into. You don't want to get into deep, huge things, but a little bit of checking. Unfortunately, because it is a fallen world, people like to take advantages of people's pain. And there's a lot of, so there's people out there right now going, hey, people are giving away indiscriminately and I can get stuff. So I'm going to go. I would totally say amen to what Brian said. If you're in doubt at all, help. This is not the time to be super worried that, oh man, I got scammed. So if you have any doubt, but that doesn't mean you just blindly, somebody shows up, asks for something and you just give it to them. There is a little bit of kind of that, taking some input, getting some information, doing a little bit of verification. You got to do it in ways that are very, again, time is of an essence here. So you'll be asking the question, how important is that? Sometimes we can do something as simple as somebody says, I can't pay my rent this month. And you get the name of the landlord, and you as the church or the institution calls them and say, hey, we're working with this person, cut them a little slack right now. And we know a lot of landlords are cutting slack anyhow, but you can be an advocate to create some space. And that allows you a little bit to check maybe some of the facts and some of the details or whatever. There's a bunch of things you can do to both be immediate, but also not to be brainless in all of this. I kind of mentioned that it's easier to check on people that are in your, I'm getting there, Brian, don't worry. People that are in kind of your own networks a little bit. And so I assume most of you already have policies at play as to which, how much you help church personnel versus outside personnel. And I would tend to keep those in place and go from there. Okay, Brian, next slide. Thank you. So one last thought, and Brian raised this, and this is this issue of, okay, there's problems out there. So historically, there's problems. There's all these problems. How do you fix problems? And I was trained in the needs-based approach. You kind of go in, you figure out the problems, what's needed to fix it. And the assumption is there's not many resources available in the person, in the family, in the community to address those. So you assume it's going to come from the outside. So it is true that in a relief situation, often people don't have a lot, but they may have some. And so part of it is asking the question, what in your family networks, are you part of a church that's doing something to find out what might be some resources that they could utilize? You want to be careful here again. We're not here trying to eliminate people to help. Should never be the mentality, but maybe there's some things that they can put in the pot, because I think both Brian and Matt mentioned, we have limited budgets right now and greater need. And so you got to be thinking, how maybe this person, they need to have $400 or $700 for the rent. Maybe they really can come up with $300. We help with the $400. That allows us to help somebody else a little bit too. So there is a place to think about what resources are there. And then lastly, I'll finish with this. As Brian mentioned, one of the great assets we have, it's one of the great blessings of being in this country, having worked in lots of countries and been in lots of places. Man, do we have a tremendously deep, thick, abundant, rich safety net. And part of our role is helping people access those and not just thinking, oh, we as the church need to be the one to do that. Sometimes it's just pointing them in the right directions for different programs that are out there that are established by the government, by nonprofits, and those are assets. And so, yeah, you need to spend a little bit of time understanding what those are. There's a website here. I just found this 2 weeks ago from a couple of my students, actually, the community development major. The organization is called Preserving something affordable housing. So they're not really all about this, but they've created this amazing website that you can put in your zip code, and then there's like food issues, transportation, loans, all these categories, and you can click on those and find in your zip code what's available. I was overwhelmed by how good this thing was. And so that may be one thing that you can use to find out these assets that are already there, so you don't become duplicating the efforts of others and therefore reaching less people.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate those thoughts. We're going to go now to Eric, pastor who's working on the ground. And you mentioned you're in a somewhat rural area, Eric, but you also have workers that go into Chattanooga. So you've got this balance of sort of white collar professionals and maybe people who come from either a more blue collar or in the service industry or might have financial needs that have become more real in this time of COVID-19. Eric, walk us through some of the things that you're trying to do to guide your church in thinking well about this.
Okay. Well, excuse me, one of the things I think that I'm trying to do and that we're trying to do as a church is what we've been trying to do for the last 20 years. We're just doing it in a more ramped up way, is that we're trying to cast a vision, I think, of being, we could say, ambassadors of anguish alleviation. This idea, I've been thinking a lot about the psalmist saying, I will be glad and rejoice in the Lord, for you knew my affliction and you knew the anguish of my soul. And so I think one of the things that we're urging our people to do, since we're not with them, we can't be out and among them. And so when we do communicate with them, we're saying, as we've often talked about generosity in our midst, we're saying, you're the eyes and ears. You're the little Christs where you are. You're the ones who are aware of trouble, of anguish, of dismay and despair that's rendering people feeling useless, rendering them to be in a situation where they don't have what they need. And so you're our eyes and ears for the benevolence of our church. And so we're urging them to a kind of creativity about that. One of the ways we've talked about that in the past, and we've tried to, I think, knead these things into the fabric of the church. And I think it's worth continuing to talk about this during this time, because one, we don't know how long it's going to be, but it is going to create a new kind of normal, perhaps, for a time. Is this idea that one of my neighbors taught me one day when my lawnmower broke, and I was in a bind and I didn't have time to get it fixed. And I called several neighbors and one of them was available. And he said, let me bring that thing right over to you. And he brought it over to me. And I said, man, you have no idea what a big help this is. And he taught me in a very colloquial way, this doctrine that we all say we believe each Sunday. I believe in the communion of saints. And he said, hey, buddy, if I got it, we got it. If I got it, we got it. And I want that to be an operative principle throughout our church. And we kind of talk like that. This kind of idea that the privileges that we have, if we still have jobs, great. Keep giving to the church. Keep giving to your neighbors, because some of them don't have jobs. And if you run out, or if the church runs out, we'll get more, because we believe that God's going to backfill. He is going to make us able to be generous on all occasions. But this idea of, if I got it, we got it. The Heidelberg Catechism says that believers, all and everyone, are members of Christ. They have communion with him, and they share in all of his treasures and gifts, and that everyone is duty bound to use his gifts readily and cheerfully for the benefit and well-being of the other members. And so we talk about that a lot, just trying to get people on the trail, on the scent of thinking the things that have been entrusted to me right now. And that might be money, and it might be time, and it might be they're listening, and it might be text messages, and it might just be sitting with a dying woman, that they are eyes and ears of compassion who say, if I've got something, that means we're a wealthy community. George Bailey taught us that, right? He's the richest man in town, even though he didn't have a big bank account, because he had this community. And so we want our people to know, and our community, a wider community, to know that this is a circulatory system of God's grace, that they can meet up with God's grace in a very concrete way through our giving. I think also of this idea that Wendell Berry says in a story. He talks about a man who's very tender with children and very tender with stray animals in town. And he says this about him: he'd been a good man all his life, but this tenderness was new. It was the tenderness of a man who'd been busy all his life, but now had a time to pay attention to useless things. been busy all his life, but now had time to pay attention to useless things. And it seems to me that there's a great number of people in our congregation and in our community right now who feel useless. They're stuck inside. They can't do anything. And depending on if they have kids, then they're overwhelmed with the hecticness of their irregularities. Some of them are bored out of their minds with more time than they ever dreamed they wanted. And a lot of people, I think, are just feeling useless. And so one of the things that strikes me that we're doing as pastors in thinking about alleviating anguish is thinking and anticipating for me and for our people, how are we paying attention to people who are feeling useless? And how can we anticipate what their needs might be in the middle of that uselessness? And I think if you start thinking about that, you start praying that way as a pastor, praying that way as a church member. Lord, how may I be an ambassador and join hands with you in alleviating and knowing the anguish around me for people who feel rather useless? I think ideas start to bubble up, and then you have to act, getting over your fear, act giving in such a way that you have to trust God to keep backfilling if you run out. I think that's probably enough time for now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Great perspectives on how you're thinking about this issue at this time and leading your congregation so well. We want to go now to Q&A, and there's been a lot of Q&A. There's been a lot of questions that have come in. I'm seeing 47 questions. Keep sending those in if you have questions that came. I'm going to try to pick ones that I think apply to the most amount of people, and we'll go from there. There's an interesting question that came in from Bruce. And I guess I'll start by going right back to you, Eric, and seeing if you have a perspective on this. Bruce Reynolds writes, in light of COVID-19, that most churches will not be able to meet all the needs of those that are asking. Is it better to meet the needs of fewer people with a bigger amount or a greater percentage, or assist more people in the church at a lesser percentage? So you kind of see the dilemma as they're trying to steward. Do we
Sure.
limit it at $50 and we help as many people as possible, or do we give bigger gifts? How have you guys thought through that?
Well, I'll tell you this, that kind of question taps into this kind of emergency that we're in. And one of the benefits that I think I have as a pastor in a situation like this is I'm a horrible planner, like an abysmal planner. So as a church, we don't do we're not good at forecasting. We know that the mercy of the world is that we don't know what's going to happen. And so there's a lot of this kind of prioritization that we're just meeting the needs as they come, and we haven't been overwhelmed yet. And so I think that our tact on that kind of thing has been, hey, we have it to give now, and this is the need we know about now, so we'll meet this now. And then we'll see what happens down the road. We are not, you can, the model of manna in the desert or the model of Joseph in 7 years, and we're not a Joseph for 7 years of storing up to meet 7 years of need. We're just thinking of this, I think, as, hey, we've got this to give, so we'll give it as it comes along. I can imagine that different churches with different sensibilities will attack that in a different way, but that's the way that makes sense to us, because it's just how we roll, because we couldn't plan ourselves out of a box.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that. Yeah, I appreciate those. Yeah, my answer to that question is yes. So because it really, you can go either way with that, right. And I think Eric is hitting it. It's just your context will make a difference there. I do think this is still a time to be asking the question of people that are part already of your lives in your churches, and making sure, I mean, those relationships are there for reasons, and just making sure that you're serving that in that well. Not to the exclusion of the stranger, that's for sure. We're definitely commanded to open our hand and our hearts to the stranger. My church is kind of in that same boat. We're getting a few more things from people we've never heard of, but at the point, not the point where feel like we're competing with resources. But some other places, I know that my son's church, it's in New York City and Harlem. It's a whole different ball game.
Right.
Yeah, great. We got a question here. I'm going to direct it to you, Brian. Question came in from Phil. He says, I agree on just give, and that's where he's at. He's fully on board with that. But he says, but are there benevolence guidelines that would be helpful for churches just now setting up emergency funds? or maybe churches that are rethinking those? What are some specific kind of best practices, policies that you really advocate for, even in this time of COVID-19?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Kind of given our reputation, we're kind of coming on strong in this particular webinar on don't hold back, be generous, don't have a lot of angst. And so we're kind of trying to really emphasize that message here today. The reality of it is, we do think that the resources we've created are pretty good. So if you read through if you read through Helping Without Hurting and Benevolence, Church Benevolence, it kind of walks you through that process, and there's lots of best practices in there. There's great tools there for creating outstanding policies. One of the kind of the key ideas in a more normal situation is that you want to some degree, kind of shift the conversation from, I need help with paying my electric bill, to a longer term conversation. How did we get into this situation to begin with? What are your real goals and dreams for your future? What resources and assets do you have, financial, relational, et cetera, that you can use to try to achieve your goals? How can we walk with you as you try to pursue those goals? And so it's a very kind of, again, asset-based, in this particular case, focusing on the assets of that individual, very participatory in the sense of, it's not just about sort of our policies, but about kind of what are your goals for your life, and how can we walk with you to help you to achieve those goals? And of course, speaking into that if the goals are crazy, but there's a whole approach there that's very asset-based, very participatory, very developmental, very long-term. And again, kind of what you're trying to do is to shift the conversation away from this transaction about this check and into a longer relational, empowering kind of approach. And so it kind of comes from that framework, and there's a bunch of tools and policies, again, in that book, and then also in the online course we hope to launch very soon. And so I do think that this is an opportunity to start to re-examine our benevolence work. A lot of times in the church, this kind of gets, it's not as exciting as some other things, quite frankly, sometimes. And I think this is a chance for us to give renewed attention to that. So we want to encourage that. We just don't want you to get too bogged down worrying right now with a lot of angst. If you don't have everything all set up right, the overall predisposition is generosity right now.
I just want to add to that, there's a chapter that has like 17 questions. And we pulled that from a lot of different resources of people that are trying to say, how do you create, your policies? And so basically you answer all 17, you kind of get your policies. And there may be a few you add for your own context that helps. But one of them is kind of what percentage are you going to use your benevolence for relief versus development, right? And kind of think about it, because we're trying to push churches more towards walking longer term with people. But I'll tell you what, we have those in our deacons policies, benevolence policies at my church. They're thrown out the window right now because there's a lot more relief work that needs to be done. And this is not the first time that's happened. We've had situations where there's just been some unusual tragedies amongst people that we in our church and that we know well, that we had to respond to, that just took everything we had. So those are guidelines, and then there's times where you adjust those.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Eric, you've got a quick comment. I also have a question right here that I want to direct to you, but go ahead and jump in if you'd like.
Well, I was only going to say that I just wanted to, I guess, as an addendum to what Steve and Brian just said, it strikes me that a lot of times our policy creating, there's an impulse, there's a wisdom to it for sure. There is also an impulse in it that is meant to alleviate our anxiety so that we can say no more easily. And so we can reduce complexities without getting involved in personal things. I'm sorry, our policy just doesn't allow that. And so one of the things I think they're saying, and I think is really critical right now, is that our lead foot is to find reasons to say yes. Mm-hmm. And so that we're already leaning towards saying yes to most of whatever we can. And there might be compelling reasons to say no, but you don't want to create policies just so that you can easily say no without having to feel anything.
That's it.
Thanks.
I want to jump in real. I mean, I just got to jump in and say something.
Go ahead, Brian.
I think Eric mentioned something earlier about manna versus Joseph, and clearly we believe that stewardship involves planning and all of that. But I think part of what Eric is trying to get at is the supernatural here, that God can do miraculous things, and there's a strong tendency. I'm at the front of the line on this, so I'm the worst case scenario of everything I'm going to talk about. There's a tendency for us to want recipes and formulas and kind of the top 10 things to do and not do when that person asks for help. The Bible tells us in James to pray for wisdom, and to actually believe the Holy Spirit could actually show up and give us wisdom in that moment is an important thing. That all three of the panelists, Stephen, Eric, and I, we're all conservative Presbyterians, and it's a pretty cerebral group, and our churches are very cerebral. And I've learned over time that the Holy Spirit really is real, and he lives in us, and he shows up and he gives us wisdom, and he makes miraculous things happen. And so I appreciate the questions we're getting, and they're important questions. They really are. Chill out a little bit. The Holy Spirit's going to show them something cool.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, when in doubt, right, and invite God into it and ask for his wisdom. That's really good. A good reminder amidst all this. Hey guys, we're going to do a lightning round because we have 99 questions that have come in. So we're going to look for 1-minute answers, and we're going to go lightning round here. We'll see how many we can get through here. I'm going to direct the first one at Eric. He says, this is from Gregory Rothbard. He says, the problem I'm finding is that people are not really willing to ask for help unless they hit the bottom. So how are you thinking about that, to be proactive, to anticipate needs, or even give people language to reach out to their neighbors? How should we think about people who are not asking for help in this time?
Yeah, I agree. That's our experience has been in nearly every case where we've helped somebody in the last 3 weeks. It's all been anticipatory. It's all been people on our end anticipating and realizing that something has changed for the person that might need something, and that they're not going to come ask. So we've just proactively offered. And a lot of that comes from our people checking in on each other, listening attentively, just like you would if you were listening to your adult child and they're telling you about difficulties in their lives, and you're just anticipating, you're reading between the lines, what might be happening. They've had some medical situations so I think that's most of what we're doing right now is anticipatory. And because most of the people, like if people have lost jobs, they're not going to come. It's going to be a while before they'd ask for help, and we're not interested in them getting to a state of destitution. We'd like to help them stay on an even keel and help bear the strain with them. This is if I got it, we got it. That means I'm not going to just sit here and be comfortable while you fret. Like if we can help easily bear the strain with you, well, let's just anticipate that and do it.
That's good. That's good. I'm going to direct the next question to Brian. Julie writes this. She says, our churches has a well-supplied relief fund, benevolence fund, but not necessarily the connections to those who are in need. How would you recommend we make constructive connections right now? A few others have been kind of worried about kind of coming in and being a solution for someone from the outside you may not have relationships with. So touch on that, both the connection issue and then the dignity issue, Brian.
Yeah, so this is a common situation for many of our churches for all kinds of reasons. A lot of our churches don't have a lot of connections with people who are poor. So this goes back to the asset-based approach. One of the assets out there are organizations and ministries that already have those connections and those relationships. They actually are already in relationship, and they often are in empowering relationships if you find good ones. And so the thing to do is to go to the website that Steve Corbett mentioned, find all the stuff that's in your community and start to visit them. Start to get to, well, it's a little hard with COVID, I understand, but get to know these organizations and say, how can we help you engage in relief well, engage in empowering things well? And so our role there might be to kind of come alongside of people already doing it rather than saying we've got to do it all on our own.
Yeah, that's really good.
Can I add just one quick comment?
Yeah.
I'm old enough, I'm 62, where, the idea of writing a check and giving it to an institution was still a safe and smart thing to do. I think there's been, by working with college students, you hear a lot of this. That's a cop out. If you're not actually being relational with people, writing a check's just a cop out. I think that's a bunch of bull. This is a great time to be writing lots of checks. So Brian said, yeah, get hold of him, because one of the first answers is going to be, we should sure use some more money. So then, okay, give it to them. And Eric, we've talked before this webinar, both of our churches are both doing direct stuff with people, but we're both funding through our benevolence organizations in our little towns that are kind of food bank type things. And we're going to not only continue that, we've upped that because they do good work.
Great. I'm going to throw this question right back to you, Steve. And it comes from Jonah. He says, is there a way to bridge the chasm between relief and rehabilitation, sort of a hybrid relief? And he says, such as creating odd jobs within the church for people. It's sort of a gleaning principle. It's you're providing relief, but also tying it to some dignifying activities. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, in a normal situation, more than yes, I would say that. Again, I think if that's possible and that isn't stopping somebody from getting help they really need, that's fine. But again, I think Brian tried to set this up. We've all tried to set this up. This is kind of a unique moment in some ways, but there's going to be other people, that aren't that affected by this. Not all of us have lost our jobs. Not all of us are scrambling. And so you want to be careful. And I appreciate the question that, yeah, maybe this is a time to act in what you would as if COVID didn't exist and just work through that. So you just have you'd have to know more of the backstory of the person to know what's possible there.
Great. We're going to go to Brian now with this one. This question comes from Lisa. She says, what would you say are best practices for folks who are ministering in the context of those who are chronically material poor and suffering the effects of the COVID-19 crisis? How does that kind of give apply here? Are there ways to think about people are not newly in this situation, but they've been here for a while, and now that's exacerbated with COVID-19?
It's a spectacular question. One of the things that we talk about in our benevolence book is that the typical person who asks your church for help is in a chronic situation. And so they typically need development, walking with them across time, but that they're going to slip back into relief moments too. And so unfortunately, people don't stay in these categories. They move around between them. And so it just takes wisdom and discernment. I think this is an important caveat to what we're saying. And so if a person who I've been walking with for quite some time suddenly is asking for lots of relief help, I'm going to ask a few questions before I give the money. That might be a little different from the questions I would ask if a person who's been employed for 30 years is asking for help. And so it takes a little more discernment, a little more walking with, a little more pause and asking, is this a real relief situation, or can they actually contribute something to their own improvement? And so presumably if you are engaged in development work with this person, you have some knowledge of them, you've learned their patterns, their habits, their ways of being, and you'll have some more discernment. And you will make mistakes. I got so many stories. I'm looking out my back window here. I'm thinking we have to stop. I had a homeless gentleman who was sleeping in a truck in my driveway that I purchased for him. He was a violent kind of criminal person, so I couldn't bring him to my house. And so it was the winter time, and I bought him a truck, and he slept in my driveway in my truck with an electric blanket from my house going out to the truck. And but I screwed up so many things there. And at one point he drove off with the truck, and I screwed it up. My next door neighbor, who's a Muslim fellow who's really sweet, went to my other next door neighbor and said, didn't Brian write some book about how to do this better? so you're going to screw it up. That's okay.
Okay. I just want to add one thing, because Brian kind of focused on, you've already know that person a little bit. So I don't know what's behind the question, but even if it's somebody you don't know, Brian said this in his first session, this is not the time to try to dig into worry about the deeper poverty issues and all that. And if they've got a legitimate need, help them, all right? And don't worry about the dependency piece, because you don't think about dependency when it's a intense crisis relief time. That's all. So I hate to have you, that would be sad to be too worried about that.
You just
I think this is going to be our last question. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
That's it. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Last question, we'll direct it to Eric. This question comes from Jack. He says, how do we help our church capture a vision of helping our community themselves, as opposed to maybe going to another ministry or person? It's not that we shouldn't look at assets outside organizations, government, et cetera, but people have resources. How do we unlock generosity? How are you helping your community think about that?
Well, one of the things that we do very regularly is just tell stories to hopefully ignite imagination about what's possible. It's struck me during this time that I think a lot of our people have a lot of compassion that's burning a hole in their pockets. They have unspent compassion that they don't know what to do with. And I think that as we tell stories about things that are possible or things that might be happening in the community, then they get an idea for that. I think we also just tell stories like, we tell stories that, like the one about the lawnmower, or a Wendell Berry story, the hurt man, this bleeding man who's being cared for by this lady who does what is set before her to do. And she says in one place, it's the Lord's own mercy that we have so many hands, because the man had many wounds. And she's being given rags and water, and this man who's been beat up, and she's tending to all his wounds. And I think about that and I say things like that to our congregation, like we're the people who have many hands for the many wounds of the world, and you are little Christs who have been situated in certain places. And so assuming that our people have compassion within them that they want to spend, and not chastising them and not trying to guilt them into things, but just giving them opportunities to think about how that might happen, and then noticing it and not being afraid to ask people. I've been so surprised at how when I ask people about things or I let them know about needs, they say things like, "Thank you for considering me to consider this." And I'm stunned, and but not really that stunned, but so grateful, because I think our people want to be asked.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric, for that. I want to point to one resource that's a really tangible resource that many of you can use that are leading churches. Some of our friends from Denver created a website called Share the Stimulus, as a lot of people are getting a chunk of money that they may not need. They're employed, they have resources, but they're getting that money anyway. Sharethestimulus.org. It's starting a movement of people who are saying, I want to take that stimulus money and give 25% of it, 50% of it, 100% of it to someone in need. Now, this website is not collecting money. They're not distributing money. All they're doing is challenging to make a pledge and then actually do it. You can see that this is updated, like daily, but there's been all these pledges and all these dollars that have been giving away. And then they actually want to capture the story. But lots of resources there for your church, where if you want to make this a campaign, you want to encourage generosity, check out sharethestimulus.org, a great resource. And this is happening around the country, where people are taking the advice of give, give, give. But how do we call and motivate the people of God to take generous steps? That's one way you can do that. I want to thank so much our panelists and for all your contributions, very thoughtful and giving us a lot of food for thought. I want to also thank everyone for their questions that came in. And I know that we couldn't get to all of them. I tried to prioritize the ones that didn't. And if we see any questions that maybe we can answer after that, we'll look for ways to respond either personally or in a general way. This will be available. This webinar will be on our website. And we're going to have another webinar next week, next Friday at 1 p.m., where we're going to be looking at unique discipleship issues and how pastors and churches can think about that well. So next Friday, we hope you'll join us again. Final word is if you would like to continue on hearing about resources of Made to Flourish, one of the most practical ways is go to our website, madetoflourish.org. In the upper right-hand corner, it says Start Here. If you click on that tab and fill it out, and if you've never done that, we're going to send you a box of resources for free. There's no gimmick. There's no charge for that. We just send it to your door if you give us your address. Things like the economics and neighborly love, work matters, some of our core resources. We'd love to do that. We'd love to stay connected with you. So go check us out at madetoflourish.org. Start Here in the upper right-hand corner. Well, thank you once again for joining us for another week of Common Practice, this time when we get together and consider how we might shepherd the church well in these challenging times. We want to hear your story, so reach out to us with the ways that you're serving your congregation, and we want to share those with our network. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next week.